Pnawn da, croeso, and welcome to this webinar by Barod, part of our Manifesto Sessions, the fourth one. And just to say just a little bit about what our manifesto is. Last year, we recognised that we needed to really influence policy and practice much more within Wales. And so we set about putting together and co-producing a manifesto with people who use services and people who deliver services. And that was about setting, I guess, a blueprint for a more equal and prosperous Wales for people who use substances. And we've got 10 asks that we believe should be a priority in Wales. And today we're looking at safer inhalation devices. You can find our manifesto on our website. You can download it from there. And also you can see all the previous manifesto sessions on our website. But the manifesto itself gives you a much more deeper dive into the subjects and priorities that we've identified. So just in terms of today's session, we're looking at safer inhalation devices, or SIDs. And these are simply a piece of equipment that acts as a key harm reduction intervention to allow for the inhalation of crack cocaine via single-use, sterile, heat-resistant glass pipe. Current services are prohibited from providing SIDs under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971. So what do we want? We call on each police force in Wales to set up a memorandum of understanding to all services to distribute safer inhalation devices. I think one of our speakers, Rick, will explain how difficult that has been. We also call for Welsh Government to support our aim and recognise the importance of SIDs as part of our harm reduction toolbox. And we call on UK Government to amend the law to allow for the distribution of SIDs. We're not asking much, I know, but anyway, we need to make sure that we advocate to the right people and make sure that we use evidence for these decisions on what we do in our services. So today we have two great speakers to help us understand the evidence around safe inhalation devices and how we can put pressure on governments and police to be able to provide these important devices as part of our harm reduction offer. So first up, please let me introduce you to Professor Rick Lines. Rick is Head of Substance Misuse and Vulnerable Populations for Public Health Wales. So I'll hand you over to Rick.
Diolch, Caroline. Pnawn da pawb. Rick Lines, UVNOE, ac diolch yn fawr am y gwahoddiad heddiw. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rick Lines, and as Caroline said, I'm the head of the Substance Use Program for Public Health Wales, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about the case for safer inhalation devices here in Wales, something that my team has been working on in partnership with Barod and other colleagues for the last couple of years anyway. Let's see if this works. There we go. So in terms of the evidence for increased crack cocaine use across Wales, we have that from a number of places. Certainly in terms of drug-related deaths, toxicology, we've seen increasing prevalence of cocaine within toxicology for the last number of years. Now, we can't disaggregate whether this is powder cocaine or crack cocaine, but we do know, for example, in the 3 health board areas in South Wales, that over the last year, crack paraphernalia has been recovered at the scene of about between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 drug-related deaths. So we know that it is a significant factor within drug-related deaths in Wales. We've seen increased hospital admissions for cocaine. Again, we can't disaggregate, but we know that overall that's going up. Certainly reports from peers and from service users, and people on this call will be familiar with that, I'm sure, from your own work, is that everyone highlights the increased prevalence and use of crack across Wales. And something we're particularly seeing is the link to Buvidal prescribing in this regard, where a significant number of people in our estimation who've been going on to Buvidal to address their opiate dependence have been moving towards crack cocaine smoking as an additional intoxicant. And finally, we have reports from drug services, harm reduction services, clinicians across Wales about increasing crack use amongst people accessing services. We're just completing now a national review of community-based needle and syringe programs, which includes, I think we visited all but 2 needle exchange programs across Wales, interviewing service users as well. And north to south, east to west, we're seeing increases in crack cocaine smoking and unfortunately injecting as well, we're starting to see. And also research from the Huggard in Cardiff. Again, from our own research and engagement with peers and service users, have lots of different bits of evidence coming from focus groups. An example, a lot of people moving away from heroin towards crack cocaine smoking. Again, part of that might be linked to Buvidal, but we're also hearing reports of people doing it essentially as a harm reduction measure, concerns about nitazines and synthetic opiates within the heroin supply, and people feeling that perhaps moving towards crack is a way to reduce their risk of being exposed to synthetic opiates. Also, in places that dealers are emphasizing crack availability more than heroin, so heroin is more difficult. Again, my team is up in North Wales at the moment, and they're hearing that from peers up in North Wales that crack is much easier to purchase than heroin. Also, that the quality of the heroin varies, so people are moving towards crack as a more consistent substance. Of course, linked to that is the demand for pipes and the need for pipes to smoke. Um, um, and linked to that, of course, is the concern coming from peers as well as service providers around the potential risks of sharing and reusing pipes or making pipes out of inappropriate or potentially toxic materials. We know from the documented evidence there's a variety of health harms linked to the smoking of crack cocaine. My team, our interest in this, I suppose, most recently was triggered by an investigation we did into a cluster of group A streptococcus infections amongst service users in Wrexham. About 10 or 12 service users all presenting with similar lesions on their extremities, hands, and lower legs, which were not injecting site infections. And my team, along with our Communicable Disease Surveillance Center, did genomic sequencing of the particular infections, identified them all as coming from a common source. And then my team went up and did interviews with the individuals. And while some of them were injectors, not all of them were. When we controlled for other variables, they all had stable housing, they all had access to showers and clean laundry, etc. The one thing they all seemed to have in common was that they all smoked crack together. So our conclusion was that the most likely source of the transmission was through either sharing pipes directly or just through the proximity that comes from communal smoking practices. The Huggard has done research amongst their own service users about the links between competition for pipes and interpersonal violence and conflict. Systematic reviews in various areas of the peer-reviewed literature have shown associations between sharing of pipes and bloodborne viruses, for example, and links to sexually transmitted infections. And of course, the use of homemade pipes, inappropriate materials, potentially toxic materials to smoke out of can cause a variety of concerns regarding respiratory health. These are some photos that have been shared by our colleagues at Barrett about things that have been provided by their own service users, as well as some photos provided to us by Professor Magdalena Harris at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, who's currently in the final stages of a big research project on safer inhalation devices. And we can see they're typically made out of a variety of things, all of which would raise concerns about inhaling, whether that's toxic fumes, whether that's bits of molten material that might melt off and be inhaled into the lungs and cause scarring. In South Wales, one of the things that we find kind of almost unique to our part of the world is the repurposing of prenoxide kits to make glass pipes. This is something that has been reported in the English literature in Magdalena's study, but is very, very common, certainly around the Cardiff area. Now, of course, we don't encourage the repurposing of prenoxide kits for crack pipes, but I guess perhaps the ironic thing or the uh, so what you'd call the term, but what we're actually witnessing is unfortunately the most innovative piece of harm reduction technology that has been developed and available in Wales at the moment, given the unavailability of actual proper glass pipes. This is actually a harm reduction technique that's being implemented and designed by service users themselves. So again, obviously we don't encourage the use of naloxone kits in this way, but we do have to recognize that this is a bit of innovative harm reduction technology that we should be learning from and adapting to meet. So all these things together led us to propose a safer inhalation devices pilot project with two main objectives. First is to decrease the harms from the sharing of pipes and the use of homemade pipes. And secondly is to increase the engagement of people who use crack with harm reduction services, keeping in mind that across Wales, we're seeing a drop off in people accessing harm reduction services for a variety of reasons. And we know that there is a growing population of people who smoke crack or use stimulants more broadly who we're not really reaching as effectively as we could through our community-based services. What is a safer inhalation device? It's essentially a kit that provides everything you need to smoke crack cocaine in a way that is more healthy and safer. It includes a heat-resistant glass pipe, a rubber mouth tip to insulate from burns, for example, or if you are sharing pipes, people can interchange rubber mouthpieces so there is no kind of contact between lip to lip contact. Specially made stainless steel gauze filters, which won't superheat and break off when you're inhaling them. A little carrying case and a wooden stick to clean the pipe. This was the kit that we actually identified for use in the pilot. We tested kits from three different suppliers. We did focus groups of people who smoke crack around South Wales to see which of the kits was preferable because they were all a bit different in a variety of ways, and we settled on the one provided by Exchange Supplies. Now, the use of safer inhalation devices is not something new internationally. Again, I'm from Canada, and I remember when I emigrated from Canada in 2000, we were starting to pilot test crack pipes, 25 years ago. Across the water in the Republic of Ireland, harm reduction services give out thousands of crack pipes in the major cities in the south of Ireland. So it's a very long established technique of harm reduction, particularly in countries that have large crack smoking populations. We see them not just in Canada and Ireland, but also in the US and parts of Latin America. And we have a certain amount of peer-reviewed literature on the effectiveness of this as an intervention. This from Magdalena Harris's review, International Evidence indicates that crack pipe supply through harm reduction and drug treatment services can reduce injecting, acute injuries, respiratory harms, and viral infections, and engage people with drug treatment services where health harm reduction and psychological interventions can be delivered. In terms of the health benefits, again, we have a number of systematic reviews looking at the evaluations of crack pipe programs, primarily coming out of Canada. And they generally show that there's a high willingness of people who smoke crack to engage with these services, a reduction in risky behavior, a reduction in sharing of pipes, a reduction in the use of homemade pipes, decline in kind of smoking related injuries, such as cuts and burns, for example. So we do have positive health outcomes as a result of these interventions. Magdalena Harris's study at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which is ongoing, their preliminary findings, they demonstrated that there was a high engagement of people who smoke crack with the pilot services that were established in, I think, 3 sites in England. A high number of people coming into drug services for the very first time. Many of those people who had only smoked crack. So a significant number of people who had been using homemade pipes, etc. So again, we're seeing preliminary results from the study in England showing some positive outcomes. But as Caroline mentioned, the big barrier here that we don't have in Ireland, for example, is the Misuse of Drugs Act, which makes it a summary offense under Section 9 to supply paraphernalia. for the use of illicit drugs. Now, the Misuse of Drugs Act has been amended to allow provision of injecting equipment, for example. Injecting equipment is not prohibited any longer under the Misuse of Drugs Act, but there is no similar amendment to allow for the provision of smoking paraphernalia. So in terms of our pilot, the first thing that we did, and an important step, was engaging directly with the South Wales Police to seek their support to allow services involved in the pilot to do so without fear of prosecution, and to encourage the police to use the flexibility and the discretion allowed for under the Misuse of Drugs Act and standard policing practice to basically protect the services and the service users at the pilot sites from arrest or prosecution. And South Wales Police were very, very supportive of this. They saw the need for the program. They saw it very much as being consistent with their own substance use and harm reduction strategy. And so we had a very productive dialogue with them over the course of about a year, going back and forth between our legal team and their legal team, etc., to draft a memorandum of understanding. The conception of the project was essentially kind of three legs of a stool, where Public Health Wales would essentially coordinate the project and be responsible for the monitoring and evaluation. Again, the police would play their role in terms of community safety and ensuring that the services themselves would not be prosecuted for participating in the program. And then the idea was that the pipes themselves would be distributed by third sector drug services as part of their standard needle exchange program. And linked into this, Public Health Wales would impanel a monitoring and evaluation group to monitor and keep records of the project. So that was where we were. We also did a health impact assessment. We have a health impact assessment team at Public Health Wales. And during the period of time we were agreeing the MOU with the police, we engaged in what's called a health impact assessment program, which culminated in a meeting of 24 individuals from across the South Wales policing area. We were looking at doing this in 3 different health boards because the South Wales policing district essentially includes Cardiff and Vale, Cwmtaf, and Swansea Bay. So we had a meeting of 24 people, which included service providers, peers, academics, Public Health Wales, people from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine who were supporting us. The health impact assessment agreed that there would be a number of potentially valuable health impacts as a result of this proposal, including decreased risk of bloodborne virus and other infections, decreased use of unsafe equipment, increased service user engagement. They also identified a number of challenges, including potential strain on services. One of the things we've seen in the English study is an increased footfall in services, which can be a challenge to try to meet the needs of an increased service user population. Concerns about funding stability and sustainability, and also access barriers, for example, in rural areas, which we know is a challenge for harm reduction services generally. And also a clear consensus that the involvement of people who use crack, both in the design and service delivery and the monitoring, was a critical aspect of success. So where are we now? This is the part where we get into the meat of the issue. In terms of the memorandum of understanding, that was concluded between Public Health Wales and the South Wales Police in September of 2024, and that kicked off what was planned to be a 4-month pre-implementation phase, where we identified 10 sites across the 3 health board areas to distribute the safer inhalation devices. We put together our monitoring and evaluation group and designed a framework to evaluate the project. We updated the harm reduction database to be able to keep records of distribution of safer inhalation devices. And then we had planned a major event, staff training event, for the beginning to middle of January 2025. We were going to have colleagues from Ireland come over. We were going to have colleagues from England who were part of the pilot study, colleagues from Exchange Supplies, from the police to talk about the legal context and agreements, etc. And that was all ready to go for the middle of January to kick off the distribution at the end of January and have it run until the end of December. But in the middle of this run-up, at the end of November 2025, the UK policing minister, Diana Johnson at the time, issued essentially a letter to all the chiefs of police, chief constables across the UK to halt the development of all safer inhalation device programs, keeping in mind that ours was only one of them. We were quite advanced in what we were doing, but there were probably 10 or 15 different areas across England where there were also various conversations going on between services and police about doing something similar. So the minister ordered a pause on all of those developments. So essentially, our project was halted in its tracks at that point in time. And we have engaged with the Home Office, we've engaged with the Minister's Office trying to see if we can progress this. To this point in time, that has not been successful. The message that we've been getting from the Home Office is that there's no real appetite at this point in time by the government at Westminster to pursue safer inhalation devices. So again, this gets back to the point Caroline was making about the need for advocacy, really, and what are we doing in terms of next steps? I suppose for Public Health Wales, it's important to emphasize that this remains a priority for us as well for harm reduction services across Wales. And it's not just a priority for us here in Wales, but across the UK as well, up in the north of Ireland and Scotland, in England. So we continue to try to build the evidence base. As I say, we've been doing consultations with service users all up and down Wales this year. And also the results of the London School pilot will be published within the next 6 to 12 months, I imagine, which will help give us some more robust evidence for England and Wales. On the advocacy side, I think my understanding is that this issue has now been escalated to sort of intergovernmental level. I know Welsh government has been very supportive of this initiative. I know Scottish government has also been seeking to develop similar programs. So there may be conversations going on at interministerial level about this. In terms of Westminster, there was a cabinet reshuffle, we know, a few weeks ago, and there is now a new policing minister in place. So whether that opens up room to reopen this discussion and room for changing or rescinding the current pause on the developments, I don't know, but that's an option. And also whether there's a possible role for the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, which is the statutory body that advises the government on drug policy, whether there's room to engage with them to see if we can request them to do an evidence review of safer inhalation devices internationally. That could perhaps be then used as a basis to try to do other advocacy around whether that's on the one hand just removing the pause to allow local relationships to build between health services and policing, as had been done before, or even moving beyond that, and whether there's ability to move forward to begin to, again, amend the Misuse of Drugs Act in the way that it's been done for injecting equipment to also allow for smoking paraphernalia. So big thanks to my colleagues at Public Health Wales who've all been involved in moving this along. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick. I mean, the frustration, you're very, very, very careful and equal in delivering all the messages for how it was stopped. But, you know, the frustration of all the work, extraordinary amount of work, the building of the evidence, the coordination of colleagues, the working and co-producing with people who use crack, you know, an enormous amount of work that went in. You know, we did a bit of work with you, but I know Public Health Wales invested so much in it. So it must be incredibly disappointing and frustrating that we can't sort of move on with it. And I know the police themselves, South Wales Police were, you know, were very supportive and happy to go along. And it's sort of like the rug was pulled out literally at the 11th hour.
Yeah, I should say it was nothing personal towards us. I think
no, absolutely
my
not.
understanding was that, as I mentioned, there were, I think, 10 or 12 sites across England that were in various stages of development as well.
Yeah.
And my understanding was that the initial pause was simply to kind of get to grips with it and try to come to like a common set of frameworks, which maybe makes sense. But then it never got past the pause to developing the standard kind of agreement. But that's where advocacy comes in, I suppose, and colleagues like Barrod and others.
don't know how much they listen necessarily to us, but having many voices saying the same thing and having evidence, like Magdalena's research. She came and spoke at our manifesto when we launched it last year, and it's fascinating what is she finding even in doing those interim findings. So hopefully, as we gather more evidence, and maybe the ACMD, as you suggested, may take a view, or maybe it will be escalated now. I mean, obviously we've got Senate elections coming up next year, so now is the time to really make sure that that is the advocacy around that is important. So so we're going to go straight over to Matt. Matt is the Managing and Technical Director of Coact Technical Support, which is a community-led training and consultancy company. So over to you, Matt, and welcome to our manifesto session.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you today. And I hear Rick's frustrations around trying to move some of this work forward. Also great to hear about you talking about Magdalena's study. I'm very happy to be the community principal investigator on that study, and I think the results are really strong and powerful. So maybe let's just explain about who I am and what the work that I'm doing. So my name's Matt Southwell. I run a technical support company called Coact, and Coact is a community-led, what's called a community-led technical support agency in the sort of UN world, which basically means we're bringing the community-led expertise from the drug user rights movement, and we're particularly playing this function called bridge building, where we seek to act as brokers, helping people who use drugs and our organizations work with politicians, the providers, programmers, commissioners, the system, and then also helping people who are trying to undertake research or deliver projects with people who use drugs. We're also helping make that work. So it's a sort of different model from more of the hard advocacy model of drug user organizing. This is much more about saying, right, you're committed to doing community-led. How do we help you do it? How do we make it work? We understand that pioneers will always make mistakes or will always learn lessons, and actually our job is to be with you as you go on that journey, not bash you in the process. There's a bit of bashing needed every now and again, but I think that's more what the drug user rights movement is trying to do. So I wanted to talk to you a bit about the guidelines that we worked on with the UN, which sets the context for the interventions that we're recommending, and particularly the discussion of paraphernalia that I want to highlight. Back in 2017, in fact, the UN was spent a long time trying to develop guidelines on stimulants. They did it about 2 or 3 times and got it really badly wrong. And they had a lot of pushback from civil society, and it just led to the UN becoming very fearful about trying to write guidelines, because every time they wrote them, they got very bashed around for trying to do it. At one point, they then showed I think the 3rd version of it to me and asked me what I thought about it. And I said, Leah, this is another really poor attempt, and if you put it out, you're going to get bashed again. And they were sort of sitting there going, oh my gosh, what do we do? And we sort of said to them, well, look, what about sitting down with a group of drug user experts who are working on stimulants? Why don't you work with us? Let us research and draft the guidelines, and then people are much less likely to bash you on the other side of it. And I think because it had been a very difficult climate, they were willing to take that risk, because it was, I think, a little bit less threatening than all the other options at that moment in time. We were very lucky to start with the series of 4 literature reviews commissioned by the World Health Organization through the Strategic Advisory Group, which is a civil society mechanism. And they did 4 sets of literature review. 3 looked at the 3 big stimulant drugs that were linked with HIV and Hep C transmission, which is methamphetamine, and then smoke cocaine or crack cocaine, and cathinones, particularly, or novel psychoactive substances, but particularly the cathinone group. So those are the 3 stimulants that we've seen affected by or impacting around HIV and hepatitis. There are other stimulants, but it does seem to be those three that are really, or those three groupings that are particularly impacting, and they're impacting different parts of the world. And so we came together, drafted these guidelines. The UN then reworked them and sort of cut out the repetition. And they've gone on to be incredibly significant around the world, recommending these 8 core interventions, including the discussion of harm reduction commodities or paraphernalia. And since that time, we've developed a training toolkit with the UN, and we've been going around the world running particularly these catalytic training events of bringing countries together to sit down and talk about their response to stimulants, look at what the UN is doing, but create the space where people can sit down and talk about how we respond. And it's it's written in quite UN-ish language, but it's actually a very progressive document. It's really recommending this. It sets the context, explains the grounds, understands the diversity of populations that are using stimulants. So also one of the key things about this work is when we bring people together, we're bringing very diverse communities together to discuss stimulants, because this impacts the trans population, sex working populations, gay, bisexual, and men who have sex with men involved in chemsex. It infects people who are living on the streets, homeless. So it's a really diverse intersecting populations, and particular issues around women who use stimulants. So really needing to address those, and also then think about the enablers that make this work happen. Now, understanding that if we don't have the right legal environment, then we get stuck, as we're seeing around stimulant pipes, particularly at this point. So look, we understand what stimulants do. I don't think I necessarily need to go through this with you, but understanding particularly that we're tackling in our work this intersection around smoke, cocaine, methamphetamine, and MPS stimulants, and starting to see that we're seeing increasing numbers of environments where we're seeing at least two of those drugs being present, and in some settings we're starting to see 3 of those drugs being present, impacting different populations sometimes, but starting to spread. We're definitely starting to see the early signs of methamphetamine moving onto the mainstream drug scene in our local area, where crack has always been the dominant drug. Right, so then these 3 major primary stimulants, and then so given the fact that we're talking about these 3 different stimulants, there's a lot of common core issues underpinning these the 3 different stimulants that we're dealing with. Definitely some different issues in terms of short acting versus long acting, and also just particularly with the MPS, people not really often knowing what they're using, that often what people think they're using isn't actually present, and that adds a whole level of unpredictability. What I think we're now starting to recognize is that, yes, we understand that harm reduction are the sort of key foundation stones to this work. We understand that having a good array of harm reduction materials is that engagement point with the community. It's that point, that's that thing that links us into the community. We're starting to see, I think, one understanding that stimulants can be associated with a particular pattern of injecting drugs, which has been associated with HIV outbreaks in Romania, in Glasgow, in Belfast, now seeing it as well. So this sort of rapid, repeated pattern of injecting. We saw this during the lockdown in Bath, where I live, used to run a peer-to-peer needle and syringe program. We started to see people suddenly getting into injecting. People had been starting to wash up their cocaine. So we had very low quality crack. So then people were starting to wash up cocaine. So there was more powder cocaine around. And then there was suddenly just everybody got into injecting cocaine, and just sitting in using rooms together, just watching people going bam, bam, bam with injecting. Very, very high risk, lots of blood around, and just people talking retrospectively how it drew them into patterns of quite compulsive patterns of using, and then also the sort of compounding risk when people were snowballing, mixing heroin and cocaine together. So that particular, I think, is important that we don't lose sight of that injecting population. And then when we think about that high risk injecting pattern, Magdalena's study also shows that, no, we definitely saw on the SIP study significant numbers of people who had been injecting drug users, who had been involved in this high risk pattern of injecting, and then they realized that smoking in a pipe gave them a very, very similar effect, but without all those risks, without trashing their veins. And we saw two patterns evolving. One is what we call pin and pipe, where people start to say, look, I still want to inject heroin. I want this surging effect of heroin, but I know that I also get that surging effect with crack by by smoking. So why don't I prepare my pipe, inject my heroin, smoke the pipe, and then I get the double wham without putting huge pressure on my, the same amount of pressure on my veins. So one was a switch to pin and pipe. We're also seeing actually quite a number of people switching to pipe and pipe, which is actually now starting to smoke crack and heroin in pipes, which I think is a interesting new transition. It does seem to be associated with quite a lot of chest problems and escalating patterns of use, particularly among people maybe without histories of heroin use. But it's interesting that drug users on some levels are ahead of us, I think, in starting to explore what paraphernalia can give them different risk profiles. Just being aware that we've now got the exchange supplies have come up with a really great pipe. One of the things we didn't get right on the SIP study was the pipe, and we had a lot of people coming to us and saying, love the concept, your pipe is bloody awful. Yeah, particularly when you're interviewing cocaine users, you get people obsessively telling you the details of what was wrong with your pipe. And we've made really substantial changes to it with the support of exchange supply. So it's now much thinner. It's got a really nice carry case. We were finding that the compressed gauzes was causing the pipe to break, so there's now got a much more extended gauze that allows the rock to fall through the gauze, so it's much more efficient. And I think it shows this really powerful process of values and preferences where people are able to inform the equipment they want and really help us get the equipment right. Also, the really nice thing about the new case is it's also really useful for self-control because it has a nice flat folding place where you can put your rock down, you can break your rock up into maybe 4 or 5 different pieces, and then over time add those pieces. You can use the case as part of your controlled using, and it really helps you better manage your use. And then understanding that for some people chasing, and I was from the original freebasing population who actually used to smoke our cocaine on silver foil. It's a much lower dose form of using, and for me it was about how I managed my self-control. This was what we were doing in the 1980s before crack piping then came in and swept that culture away. But I mean, I learned from the sort of old Dutch freebase smoking culture that came before we got pushed by this sort of American crack smoking culture. And I'm not sure it's possible to drive people back to that, but it was definitely something that helped me regulate my drug use by not having this very high surging dose. It's some levels more similar to snorting lines of cocaine in terms of its dosing range. It's a layered dosing model. Also, we need to be aware of cathinones and methamphetamine. We'll need these bowl lollipop type pipes, what we call meth pipes. But because it's a different form of smoking, glad to see that exchange supplies have got both pipes available. The challenge, of course, is the legal status. So in terms of harm reduction, I think it's just being understanding that we really need to think through systematically how we support people around stimulants, understanding that, yes, we need to respond with a plentiful supply of needles and syringes, but we also need to be offering pipes as a way of drawing people into services. Now, and then just to talk about pipes, it's also understanding that pipe kits normally are not just a pipe. It's also good to give out other materials as well so that we can support people. Sugar-free chewing gum, I think, is a really powerful tool to help people with dental care. And just thinking about it as a broader suite. We're just about to produce a technical guide on stimulants, which is targeted at lower middle income countries. And I think, partly with my frustration with the UK is also highlighting we are now documenting examples of stimulant pipe distribution in Kyrgyzstan. So Kyrgyzstan had a really powerful scheme where people were reached out through a combination of online outreach and then offering this type of stimulant pipe kit to people. And then that was then exchanged for people taking part in HIV testing, and that led to a whole engagement of much more diverse populations of drug users, really reaching into that intersecting populations. We are now, we've just documented, Coact's just documented a small short-term pilot that took place in Jakarta, giving out stimulant pipes. They already do methamphetamine outreach in Jakarta, but they were able for a period of time to also give out bongs or smaller short meth pipes. We're now talking to the Egyptian government about potentially doing meth pipe distribution to support their hepatitis C elimination program. Egypt is one of the countries that's on target to eliminate hepatitis C. And they had a generalized hepatitis C outbreak, which really led to this big presidential initiative to eliminate hepatitis C. But then the WHO sat down with Egypt and said, look, if you don't tackle needle and syringe programs, you don't tackle opiate agonist maintenance programs, you're not going to eliminate hepatitis. And then on the back of that, we're able to then say, and if you don't reach these much more marginal populations using stimulants, then we'll still end up with hepatitis C not being eliminated. So this is where WHO are very clear that stimulant pipe distribution is well proven and recommended as an engagement tool. So clearly these are the guidelines I was showing you are joint WHO, UNAIDS, UNODC guidelines. So stimulant pipe distribution is absolutely recommended, but recommended as an engagement tool. I think its function as a prevention tool is less clearly identified at this point. We definitely know that that hepatitis C can be found on pipes that are returned in exchange schemes. So we definitely know that hepatitis C is making it onto pipes. We know that hepatitis C survives for a long time outside the human body, up to several days. And then we know that cut bloodied lips, which come from dehydration, sharp pipes, hot pipes, hot air, all of those things end up opening up a potential pathway. And it's what we call a low-level repeated risk. So it's not something that is a profound risk like sharing needles and syringes, but it's a low-level repeated risk. And it's just this cumulative behavior. If you're multiple people are engaging in pipe sharing, it just creates that space. And definitely what we found on a SIP study was that there were people in our focus groups definitely describing, yes, one person had a cold sore and a week later everybody had cold sores. One person had flu, a week later everybody had flu. So clearly other viruses, other bacteria spreading through pipes. So I think when people have got very lowered immune systems from using pipes, I think there's a huge advantage to understanding that it's not great to be getting colds and flu viruses and just constantly knocking your immune system. Now, we may not notice it all the time if we're taking opiates and withdrawing and taking other drugs, but it's still taxing our system. It's still making us more vulnerable, and it also makes it harder to manage our drug use because you're not quite sure, what am I feeling? Is this flu? Am I sick? What am I sick with? Is it virus? Is it withdrawal symptoms? And it just becomes much harder to manage already challenging lives. So look, I'm really looking forward to running the launch of our stimulant pipe distribution technical guide and showcasing how we're trying to do work in Kyrgyzstan and Jakarta and Egypt. And then back in the UK, here we are 20 years after this intervention was first identified, 20 years after Mark Kinsley first went out onto the streets of New York and noticed that people with crack were being ignored by the HIV response. So in the 1990s, Mark started giving out stimulant pipes, and he said to me, the first time they went out people turned around to her and said, "You've noticed us. Finally, you've noticed us. We thought we had to start injecting drugs to be noticed. You've noticed us." And he said it was just such a powerful engagement to everything else that then comes with that drug work engagement. If we don't have that point of connection with people, that point of place that gives them a reason to talk to us, then we're not offering services. 30 people came into services at Bristol Drug Project on the first day the pipe scheme opened, because people had heard through the research study that pipes were going to be available. People had heard that the pipes would be available. 30 new people came into service in that first day. Some people had quite profound health issues that they were then talking about: HIV, SDIs, a whole different health issues that people were addressing. And it just gives people this connection. And on some levels, I've been fighting with the WHO about, is it just an engagement tool or is it a prevention tool? And I think when we come back to, I think I never again will say just an engagement tool, because the SIP study makes me go, it is an engagement tool. What an amazing tool to bring people in, to start talking about their health, to start having conversations. And then the conversations we had with people on the streets, talking to people, sitting out smoking, talking to them about pipes, talking to people who had chains around their necks with their own personal metal pipes, starting to be able to really reinforce those people who were switching away from injecting, reinforce those people who were already keeping their pipes personal, but helping those people. I mean, some of the people we worked with had horrendous, one woman had picked herself through compulsive picking disorder through to her bone. Had been in hospital for 2 weeks to have that repaired, and then was back out on the streets again straight away again. Just sitting there watching people picking their faces, and just this low level challenges that people are facing. And then these just really profound unmet need around mental health. We're pushing a population of people with drugs and mental health coexisting conditions backwards and forwards between mental health and drug services, with both services saying it's somebody else's responsibility, not mine. And I just seeing some of these people sitting on the street together, and how profound their needs were, and just thinking that this simple tool could help bring those people into an engagement and give them a sense that we care about them and want to respond to them. So then it gives you up to then start talking about all these other things about harm reduction that we can engage people in, all these other things that we know about. It allows you to start using interventions that we developed all these years ago, back in 2004, tools with the RCGP to help assess people's needs around crack cocaine, to screen their needs, to start to monitor where they are, and then start to bring people into services. This is the updated version that we've just developed. We're just doing the crack version. We've got versions of this on ketamine, methamphetamine, cathinones, and smoke cocaine. They are health checks that help screen people's health issues around stimulant drugs, and then they have a supporting harm reduction guidelines that help GPs and other people who don't see stimulant users so often, but help them use the core skills that they have as health practitioners to assess people and guide them. All of this becomes possible if we do pipe distribution. Just to highlight that pipe distribution is one of the commodities that exists within the 8 interventions recommended by the UN. And I'll stop at that point and let people ask questions.
Thank you very much for that. As you say, the fact that we're still got these, profound, as you say, mental health issues, and we're not engaging with these groups in this simple tool. And I see what you say. We're now learning from Indonesia, Kyrgyzstan, and Egypt in terms of evidence-based harm reduction initiatives to, for the health of individuals and our citizens. It's stark. That struck me very, very strongly. And yet, just a simple pipe, to get people talking, and then to be able to provide all these other things. It seems simple to me. It seems absolutely we should be doing it. Yet the law is an ass, as they say, and is preventing us. But thank you very much for that. That was fabulous.
So it's a really
Yeah.
good example. I mean, when we talk about harm reduction, we obviously always focus on behaviors, but we need to focus on laws as driving harm as well. And this is a perfect example. As you talk to colleagues in the Republic of Ireland, where they're doing loads of pipes, and it just evolved naturally as part of service provision. They don't have a legal barrier in the same way we do. And people started to
No,
smoke more. They identify a need in their client population, and you adapt your services to meet those needs. Very basic, simple
absolutely.
health interventions. What happens, what we do when we
Ah,
don't have a legal barrier stopping us from
ah,
making those kind of.
absolutely. Yeah, and we as services need to respond to the ever-changing, sort of landscape out there. We know that people are using more crack and smoking crack. We know that injecting heroin is reducing. We know these things are happening, yet we are barriers, sort of institutional and legislative barriers for us being able to respond appropriately to the needs of our citizens. I mean, I don't want to go on a soapbox, but it is frustrating. But anyway, so, and thanks for helping me feel even more frustrated. But anyway, I'm going to offer, I'm sure people would like to ask questions, and I'm going to pass you over to Lucy, who's putting those questions together.
If we start off with Rick, so the question was, what is the justification for allowing injecting supplies but not safer inhalation devices? Do they claim it would encourage drug use?
Well, it's the same basis that harm reduction always fights again. Harm reduction everywhere in the world lives and survives in an environment where zero tolerance is the assumed natural order of things. And that's why even with things like injecting, we're constantly having to defend that. Every time there's a new government comes into power, every time there's a new, person coming in with some sort of decision making, as harm reductionists, we're constantly having to re-educate people. Like, not that they're bad people necessarily, but people were all raised in an environment in which kind of just say no is seen to be the acceptable, normal, quote unquote, response. In terms of injecting equipment, again, as we know, one of the things that drove needle exchanges, for better or worse, around the world really was this control of contagion, where people who use drugs were seen as a source of contagion for the wider population. And therefore, we justify needle exchange programs to kind of control that contagion. I'm using that word very much in quotation marks. So because they could demonstrate that, and there was this, fear of HIV spreading more widely through the population, through the more vulnerable populations, it probably became an easier step than looking at harm reduction, as Matt said, in a way that we're not looking at broadly contagious diseases, but we're looking at health and well-being. Really, how do we recognize? And I say something I've talked to Magdalena a lot about as well. It's like, we're going to look at non-communicable diseases, respiratory health, cardiovascular disease, all these other kinds of non-communicable diseases that people who use drugs are often suffer in much higher percentages. And this, to me, is part of that broader thing about looking at harm reduction. It's not just as communicable disease control or contagion control, again, to use that kind of nasty phrase. And that's a jump to this day. I mean, some of the conversations I've had with colleagues in Wales, trying to get them past this idea of only seeing harm reduction as an HIV prevention tool. And saying, well, no, it's not just about that. In some circumstances, it is, but there's so much more that we can do.
And I'll just give a question to Matt as well, and then we'll kind of finish up. So if we see a rise in cathinones like in Europe, then the need for redosing could lead to larger outbreaks of HEP and HIV, as we saw with methadone. Could the World Health Organization have an impact on the Home Office and our ability to offer pipes?
Look, I mean, the real sadness is the World Health Organization has just been devastated by US funding. It's taking a 50% cut. We're waiting to see the UNAIDS, the UN's joint AIDS program has just been sunset for 2026. So it's pretty devastating times for the global community. I get very frustrated that the UK signs up constantly to the global aid. It's a signature to the global aid strategy, which commits to community models, it commits to harm reduction, it commits to all of these things. And in good old colonial terms, it's very good at turning around to everybody else in the world, particularly low middle income countries, and patronizing them, telling them how they should respond, but then doesn't come home and apply those things. I mean, the UK's engagement in the global architecture at the moment is only through justice, it's only the Home Office. We don't have the Department of Health present anymore. So we're not having health to health conversations around drugs anymore, which is really concerning. And it's really great to see Scotland trying to forge their own path on their own. No, but it's difficult because Westminster is very controlling in these relationships, unfortunately. But I think we can start learning from each other. So we can start saying, look what the people in Kyrgyzstan are doing, look what the people in Egypt are doing, and start to share between countries. And hopefully we can turn around this colonial international development thing and actually learn from other countries rather than always expect everybody else to learn from us.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Rick. That was brilliant. Thank you for giving up your time. I certainly appreciate it, and everybody on this session will as well. I'd just like to, and also Lucy and the team and Bertie, who make all this happen. I just turn up on the day and they tell me what to do, but you actually are the powerhouses that make this happen. And just to let you know, we've got the next webinar session is about a trauma-informed practice, specifically about our journey, Barra's journey in becoming a trauma-informed organisation, and that's on the 20th of October. Love to see you there, and thanks again.
If you have been affected by any of the issues discussed in today's podcast, please reach out. Barrod have a free and confidential live web chat service that is available 7 days a week on our website at barrod.cymru, where you can chat to a trained support worker. Alternatively, you can contact Wales's National Drug and Alcohol Helpline, Dan 24/7, either by calling 0808 808 2234 or text Dan to 81066.